Hello, welcome to the monthly teaching video of Safe Space Community. SSC seeks to equip the body of Christ with basic mental health literacy from the medical, psychological, spiritual, and relational perspectives by integrating psychology and theology. This is session number 15. I am Dr. Edmund, a licensed psychotherapist, and I am your facilitator in SSC. The title of today's topic is Grief Ministry in the Aftermath of Disaster or War. I will first give you the introduction, then I will proceed to lay down the concept and ground preparation for this topic. Then I will touch on community mourning, and after that, attending to the grieving process, sudden deaths, survivors' guilt, ambiguous losses, and children's grief. And I will close with some miscellaneous matters. Now, the introduction. In the end times, there will be more disasters and wars, resulting in a massive loss of lives, properties, and communities. Besides physical, medical, livelihood, and other basic needs, the survivors will face psychological struggles as they grieve over their losses. And a typical activities chart for rescue, relief, and recovery in the aftermath of a disaster or war is as follows. First, of course, there is the early stage of preparation. Then when the catastrophe happens, there will be a rescue phase, mostly on search and rescue, medical treatment, logistics, communication, and care management. And even as the rescue continues, then comes the relief phase, providing medical treatment, attending to the basic needs, and there will be psychological first aid, cleanup, and repair. And only after the 3 months to about a year, there is the recovery phase. And normally the activities comprises attending to the basic structures, establishing back the community, attending to the livelihood structures, and resuming education. But we see in many of the news reports, for example, this is one reported by Reuters after the Fukushima tsunami. Survivors find few comforts to cope with their losses. And 10 years after the tsunami, it is reported that grief still haunts the living. And the Japanese government did a study 3 years after the tsunami on the children, and they found that they still are struggling with psychological issues which will haunt them for the rest of their lives. So the revised activities chart in response to the aftermath of disaster or war at the recovery stage should include an item in Ministry of Mental Health, especially on grief support. Thus, grief support in the aftermath of disaster or war is an excellent opportunity for community outreach and evangelism. This month's teaching video presents a model learned through leading a grief ministry team to Tacloban in the Philippines, an area worst affected by the 2013 super typhoon called Haiyan, a Category 5 storm. The model is based on a community approach, but the same principles can be adapted to tailor for one-to-one ministry. Now, the concept and the ground preparation. First of all, the rationale of it. Rescue and relief works are mostly undertaken by the government and other international agencies up to 3 months after a catastrophe. Their focus is on conducting search and rescue operations to find the survivors and providing the medical treatment, the food and the shelter, psychological first aid, and other basic needs, as I've said before. After the initial 3-month period of attention and limelight, the survivors are much left to recover for themselves. At this time, the government's aids and services are usually slow in coming and inaccessible to many people, especially the poor. Grief ministry is provided to the survivors 4 to 12 months in the aftermath of the disaster or war, when they are still struggling with mental health issues to adjust to the new normal. And under these aftermath conditions, the two most prominent mental health issues to be addressed are trauma and grief. Trauma results from the suddenness of what was experienced, while grief results from the break of attachment from what was lost. Some differences between trauma and grief are as follows. Trauma is a mental disorder. Grief is merely a relational condition. Trauma is usually attended to in the initial phase of the mental health crisis intervention, while grief support is provided in the later phase of mental health restoration. Trauma intervention is short. Grief support is longer. Trauma intervention is carried out by the counselors and the psychologists, with referrals to the psychiatrist. Whereas grief support is best done by the relatives, friends, and caregivers under the guidance of mental health professionals. The approach for trauma intervention is usually on a one-to-one or group basis, whereas the approach to grief support is usually family or community-based with one-to-one for special cases. The purpose of trauma intervention is to bring resolution to the mental health well-being of the survivors. As the focus of this presentation is on grief ministry, the teaching on trauma intervention is covered in another video. Nevertheless, some intervention guidelines for sudden losses will be given here. The purpose of grief ministry is to bring some closure to the survivors, help them to come to terms with their losses and move on in life. It includes helping the children of the affected community to address their fears and grief. Now, who are the targeted recipients? The grief ministry adopts a community approach which involves the community leaders of the affected area and the church leaders of that locality and surrounding areas. The community and church leaders will be first ministered, trained, and empowered to serve as interpreters and lay counselors, as well as in follow-up actions after the ministry team has left. The target recipients are the families of one disaster or war locality, including their children, to make up approximately 650 survivors in total, including the local leaders. Now, the time frame is about 8 days. The ministry team will meet at the airport and then they depart to the affected area. Then the second day will be the ministry training and empowering of the local leaders. And on day 3, there will be a morning of community mourning with trauma intervention for selected individuals. And the grief ministry will start on day 4 with one batch of 300 survivors who will undergo teaching and small group counseling together with children ministry. And this continues on day 5 for the first batch. Then the second batch of another 300 survivors will undergo the process for 2 days before the team departs on day 8. And so I will now lay down the modus operandi. The grief ministry is spearheaded by a ministry leader and a ministry executive. The ministry executive must be prepared for mobilization to an affected locality soon after the disaster or war. In between field deployments, he is to network with relevant local leaders in disaster-prone countries or war zones for future collaborations. The ministry executive should join the Christian relief agencies normally dispatched to the affected locality up to 3 months after the disaster or war for the purpose of familiarizing with the ground conditions, getting to know the people there, as well as assessing the needs. The ministry executive would then plan and coordinate the logistical groundwork at the affected locality to prepare for the grief ministry targeted to take place in the period 4 to 12 months after the catastrophe. The ground preparations include the promotion and pre-registration of 2 batches of the survivors, each batch targeted at 300 adults plus the children. Each batch will be participating for 2 full days of ministry, that is from 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., with food provided, that is lunch and 2 tea breaks. Meanwhile, the ministry leader at the home base will train, mobilize, and prepare the ministry team for deployment to the affected area. Team members will pay for their own travel and accommodation expenses. And after arriving at the affected area, the ministry team will spend day 2 with the local Christian leaders and the community leaders in team orientation, briefing and instructions, ministry to the local leaders, and equipping and empowering the local leaders to minister to the community and for follow-up actions. On day 3, the entire community, comprising the local leaders, approximately 50 of them, the survivors, comprising batch 1 300 and batch 2 300, together with their children, will spend a morning in mourning, while in the afternoon, those who are still badly traumatized will be ministered to. And starting with day 4, the ministry team and the local leaders will then minister to the first batch of survivors and their children for 2 days, followed by the second batch in the next 2 days. If necessary, the local leaders will serve as the interpreters. For the adults, the ministry will comprise both teaching and small group counseling. For the children, the ministry will be provided by a dedicated team for children ministry volunteers, together with the local leaders. After day 8 and the departure of the ministry team, the ministry executive will continue to monitor and serve the community in the affected area for 1 to 2 months, including giving feedback to the home base and follow-up ministry with the survivors alongside the local leaders. And so after laying clear the approach and the format, let me go on to talk about the community mourning. The community mourning follows the Jewish practice of Shiva, lasting several hours to 7 days, as stated in Genesis 50:10. The doors of the community hall are kept open throughout the morning. Mirrors are covered and some candles are lighted. No music is allowed and casual, light-hearted talk is discouraged. Mourners wearing plain, muted clothes come in ungreeted. They sit low on the floor to signify humility. Some chairs are provided for the elderly. Family members, relatives, and close friends gathered around each other. The morning begins simply with a prolonged time of silence. In between, time is allocated for the sharing of good memories of the deceased, while their photographs are showed to the loved ones. Scriptures are then read. We can have scriptures for mourning, scriptures about comfort, and scriptures about the resurrection. And there will be a time praying for God's comfort to come upon the family members and the rest of the survivors, as well as praying for the other needs. And for the ending, there will be a blessing before adjourning to a community lunch. And next, attending to the grieving process. The protocol for attending to the grieving process of the bereaved loved ones using the time approach are as follows. T standing for telling for loss, I standing for issues to be resolved, M standing for meaning is being sought, and E is ending and referral. To learn more about the time approach, kindly watch our SSC monthly teaching video V02 entitled The Jesus Model for Grief Support, accessible at www.safespacecom.org. And now, attending to sudden deaths. First, the nature of sudden deaths. In sudden deaths, first there is a high sense of unreality of the loss. There is helplessness as our world of order and control is shattered. And there's a need to blame as someone must assume responsibility. There will be more guilt feelings than normal deaths. And there is increased need to understand and find meaning. And there will be many unfinished businesses. Unfinished businesses are those things inside of you that you would want to be said to your departed loved ones, but now it's too late. And it's more difficult to start grieving due to the legal, police, medical, and other uncertainties facing the bereaved loved ones. And the intervention guidelines: first, get the family together and away from the scene of commotion. Help them to actualize or make real the loss. Encourage them to focus on the loss rather than the circumstances or the blame, and facilitate them to express their unfinished businesses. If there is trauma, example, intrusive or avoidance responses, this must be addressed before supporting them in their grief. Now, what about attending to survivor's guilt? Survivor's guilt is a mental condition that occurs when a person believes they have done something wrong by surviving a traumatic or tragic event while others did not survive. This arises from their sense of frustration that there is not much that they can do to prevent the death. Hence, the self is a convenient target of blame. At times, the survivors may have even done something, what he or she thought best or most reasonable under the difficulty and uncertainty of the situation, but to no avail. Survivor's guilt is revealed mostly in statements such as, "If I had only," or "If only I had not done this or done that." Survivor's guilt is a form of false guilt which can be dispelled by subjecting it to an evaluation of rationality or reality. An effective rational or reality statement is, you did not cause the death of your loved one, and it was not your fault, not your choice that you survived. What's important is to establish that the survivor has acted in a manner reasonably expected of him or her, and that under the circumstances, nothing more can be done. When the survivor can accept that there is no strong basis for the self-blame, pronounce that as an independent third party, you see him or her not responsible for causing the death. Now next, I'll go on to talking about attending to ambiguous losses. There are two categories of sudden deaths. The first one is validated losses, where the body is found. And the goal of intervention is some form of closure for them to come to terms with their losses and move on with resilience. And the approach is support group or individual approach for specific needs. Then the second category for sudden death is ambiguous losses, where the body is not found. The goal of intervention is to strengthen resilience without closure, and the approach is usually family or community approach. Now, for your information, in the Haiyan disaster, 4,500 people were swept away by the storm and their bodies were never found. And the nature of ambiguous losses. The departed, for example, the missing persons, is physically absent but psychologically present. And so the loss is living, ongoing, and progressive. The loss is usually disenfranchised, that means not acknowledged. And the family member functions are immobilized with confusion over their roles. And relationships are usually conflicted. The grief is frozen and the ongoing despair is paralyzing. And family rituals and celebrations are often cancelled. And ambiguous losses do not lend themselves to easy or quick resolution. And the approach strategy to attending to ambiguous losses. For ambiguous losses, two perspectives must be modified or relearned to enhance resilience. Number one is thinking dialectically, and number two, accepting non-absolutes. Dialectical thinking is holding two opposing ideas or thoughts at the same time, since the loved one is both absent and present. We can talk about what is lost, like not being together, and grieve that part of the loss. And we can talk about what is still present of that person to celebrate his or her goodness, work, and legacy. In accepting non-absolutes, it is noted that mastery is the ability to manage one's life, to be in charge and have things one's way. When expectation of mastery is too high, we seek absolutes or perfections. Example, being totally present or totally absent. When expectation of mastery is too low, we become passive and fatalistic. In ambiguous losses, mastery must be moderated for the survivors to adjust to life despite the uncertainty and half knowledge, differentiating what one can control and what one cannot control. And so the intervention guidelines are as follows. Number one, normalizing ambivalence. Help them to live with the tension of contradictory feelings, example, love and hate, and bring ambivalent feelings into the open. Do not press for closure and encourage them to be tolerant of unanswered questions. Number two, reconstructing identity. Identity is how we and others see us. Is a woman whose husband is missing a wife or a widow? The reconstruction lies not in one's absolute identity, but dialectically in the old and the new. Example, as wife of the missing person and now taking the role of a mother and a father. Number three, revising attachment. Help them to live with the prospect of recovering the lost person while recognizing that the loss may be permanent. Hold on to the ambiguity of attachment and simultaneously finding new connections with others. Number four, finding meaning. Meaning is making sense of a situation, and meaning is essential from promoting resilience. Finding meaning through trusting God increases the survivor's tolerance for unanswered questions. And the last one is discovering hope. Hope is belief in a future good. Hope lies in change rather than holding on to the status quo. Interaction with others, having the same losses, and listening to their stories can facilitate the discovery of new hope. Thus, we seek to provide a safe environment for the expression of individual perceptions about their ambiguous losses to be validated and accepted by the other survivors as a community of people with the same losses. Finally, attending to the children's survivors. Children survivors also need ministry to work through their grief. If they have lost their parents, these children need to know who will now care for them. And normal manifestations of grieving children up to 11 years old include regressive behaviors such as bedwetting and thumb sucking, separation anxiety and fear of abandonment, fear of another catastrophe coming, or others close to them will also die. Guilt due to some magical thinking that they have caused the death of their loved ones by the careless words that they said, and having learning difficulties. The normal manifestations of grieving adolescents include feeling different from one's peers, diminished social competency, a sense of powerlessness, inability to concentrate, utter loneliness, restless mood, and there may be guilt, anger, and or fear. So the intervention guidelines include talking freely with the children about the deaths individually and as a family, especially during their teachable moments. These are the times when the children want to talk about their departed loved ones. Give consistent reply to their questions about the deaths, even when they are asked repeatedly. Don't be afraid to cry together with the children. They need to know that you understand the depths of their pain. Engage the children in play, even as the bereaved adults mourn, as they cope better through play activity. And we need to communicate with the children at their level of understanding. And a good example is through drawing or art. And so finally, I want to talk a little bit about who can be involved. Any practicing Christian, usually not a new believer, with love and compassion for others and willing to help and witness to people in need can apply to join the ministry team. But the first priority is given to qualified counselors or those with some basic training in lay Christian counseling. And medical personnel are particularly welcome since they can run a medical clinic during the break times. And the ministry leader is tasked with promoting the ministry at the home base and recruiting the volunteers, as well as training them in trauma intervention, grief recovery, hope and resilience building, and children ministry to prepare the volunteers for mobilization. And what qualities are best suited to serve as volunteers? First, one must have a non-judgmental attitude and able to maintain confidentiality, can refrain from giving thoughtless or worldly advice. One must be able to listen without interrupting, yet willing to confront a person's negative statements. And the person must be able to handle one's own life's stresses and problems. And finally, they must be available for the training and for the duration of the ministry, willing to pay for their own cost of travel and accommodation. So this comes to the end of this month's teaching video. I wish to thank you for watching our SSC series. This is session number 15, and the topic is grief ministry in the aftermath of a disaster or war. To receive our latest free monthly teaching videos and case study blogs, kindly subscribe to our website www.safespacecom.org. I look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.